the Taxation Bright Line Test for Residential Land Bill. The question is that Part 1 stand part. Just to make it clear, Part 1 is debating clauses 3 to 15 on SOPs 138 and 139. The Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr Chairman, to just put on record the Labor Party's position that we support measures to cut property speculation. However, we would argue that this piece of legislation is not only weak, it has been done in haste. It will not achieve the objectives it set out. In fact, I suspect, sir, and I predict that we'll be back here before the end of the parliamentary term amending the legislation. Sir, I want to use it as an example in terms of the lack of coherence and the problems associated with this bill to turn directly to clause 15.9. Part of the definitions deal with the main home. And I want to quote from an article of November 9 of this year from one Terry Boucher, who is an accounting expert, who said, quote, "We do not believe that the introduction of the Bright Line test for residential land is sound tax policy." Now, that was not a quote from Mr Boucher, sir. That was the opening line from the Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand, that is CANS, the opening sentence to their submission to the FEC on this bill. Sir, if you look at 15.9 as an example of a lack of coherence and a definition that one could shoot peas through, it talks about the main home meaning for a person the one dwelling A that is mainly used as a residence by the person, brackets, a home, brackets, and B, with which the person has the greatest connection if they have more than one home. Now, I'd like to start by asking the Minister in the chair and through him his officials, how on earth officials are going to be able to police that, the greatest connection? Is there going to be some sort of levitation or some sort of, is the IRD going to sort of find its softer side and start judging people's feelings and how they sort of define their connection with their main home? Sir, the Minister has said in his statement about this bill, quote, that the bill will ensure that people pay their fair share of tax, and further, quote, by supplementing the current intention test in the Income Tax Act, it will make rules simpler for taxpayers to understand and easier for the Inland Revenue to enforce. Yet, sir, if you look at the counter-argument put forward in the officials' report to the FEC, in the submission of both the Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand and Ernst & Young, they say the government could achieve its policy objective by supplementing the intention test more simply and coherently by amending section CB6. They go on to say that the differences between the Bright Line test and the current land sales rules are likely to increase uncertainty and cause confusion, quote unquote. So on the one hand, you've got the Minister who says this piece of legislation will be nirvana, will create a simpler regime for taxpayers, will ensure that there is certainty, and then you have the experts, and I know Mr Bennett, who chaired the committee, is actually a chartered accountant or that profession. So I'm going to be really interested, sir, in the contribution of that learned member, who I'm sure knows far more about this legislation than anybody else in the House, whether he joins with EY and the Chartered Accountants of New Zealand and Australia, who say this will cause increased uncertainty and cause confusion. So the basic principle of tax policy, as I understand it, is it has to be simple, it has to be clear and transparent, and generally speaking, sir, not retrospective, as parts of this legislation are. And sir, I'd be grateful if the Minister could tell us how the IRD are going to judge a person's main home in terms of, quote, in section 15.9, the person's greatest connection. How is that? What is the criteria for that? How is that going to be defined, sir, so that people have certainty and so that this legislation will not create confusion and, sir, will provide the basic rudimentary, will stand up to the basic rudimentary analysis that one would expect perhaps from a court of law. Sir, there are other exemptions dealt with in this legislation, for instance, farmland. And I'd like the Minister to take us through, in the definition, sir, of farmland, Mr Chair,
The Honourable Clayton Cox.
in terms of the definition and exemptions around farmland. What is the situation, for instance, where a farm has a number of houses situated on it, perhaps for the farm manager per se? How is that going to be dealt with in respect of this legislation? I'd also like the Minister to outline for us why it was that the government did not take the Treasury advice and put in a bright line test of 2 years rather than the bright line test that was suggested, that being 5 years. Now, a number of submitters have said that the unintended consequence of this 2-year bright line test, or maybe it is the intended consequence from the government, is that those that the government purports allegedly to be going after, that is the speculative community, will change their behaviour and will simply hold for 2 years and move after that. Whereas one of the consequences, and where this will actually whack people, is if there is a death in the family, an unintended consequence of somebody losing their job, hardship per se, which isn't dealt with in any way or shape or form in this legislation, that person may well be forced to sell their home inside the 2 years because of the change in their personal circumstances around hardship. And where you will get, I suspect, inequity, and a number of in the accounting profession, remember the Law Society also opposed this, so not only the Chartered Accountants, and they raised this issue. Nowhere in this bill is it dealt with. So I'd like to ask the Minister, what happens to Mr and Mrs Bloggs if there is unintended hardship, say they do lose their job, somebody has cancer, there's a death in the family, name a number of scenarios that you like, and they are forced to liquidate in order to survive. Where is that dealt with in this legislation? Because it's not. And why was it that the government refused the Treasury advice, sir, to make the bright line test 5 years? I suspect we know the answer, and the answer is that this is really a fictitious piece of legislation. It's designed, as many actions of the government are, to make it look like they're doing something about property speculation in Auckland, because after years of this side of the House putting their feet to the fire and public opinion growing and growing and growing, sir, they've woken up, read their polls and said, hey, we better be seen to be doing something. Seen to be doing something. And so they've said, look, we'll bang in a 2-year hold. Now, let's get real about it. If you're making 17 to 20 points per annum, as many people are in Auckland, in terms of capital gain, well, you know, you're going to hold for 2 years. Why wouldn't you? Where are you going to get a better return than an Auckland property anywhere in the economy? But if you, Mr and Mrs Bloggs, who fall on hard times, sir, something happens in your financial arrangements and you are forced to sell within that 2-year period, you get whacked. Whereas many submitters in this eminent accounting firms and others pointed out, the inequity will be a change in behaviour by the speculative community who will simply hold on for 2 years and then do what they've always done. And as noted, sir, in the submission that I read out by the Chartered Accountants NZ in Australia and EY, if the government was really serious about tackling this issue, they would deal with and strengthen the intention test, which is as loose as today. In fact, the IRD has lost court cases around it. They would actually deal with that. But that intention test, which can be defeated by simply saying, what was your intention? Well, in buying the property, well, my intention was to move to Auckland, but then the partner changed their mind and said they didn't want to move to Auckland, so we sold. That, in law, sir, is very, very difficult to defeat. Extremely difficult. So why is it, and what is the meaning of connection, greatest connection in terms of the main home? That'd be a really interesting one to do. One the IRD is going to sort of, as I say, get the softer side going, do a bit of levitation and work out what people's feelings are towards one of the residences which they deem to be their main home. How is that actually going to work in practice, sir? Because you could shoot peas through that definition. So those are some of the questions, sir, as we go through the shambolic piece of legislation, rammed through and rushed through, that we'd actually like some answers.
I'm calling Julianne Genter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.